The wind doesn't just bite, it howls. Out on the frozen plains, in a time before roads, power lines, or grocery stores. One question decided who would survive and who wouldn't. What do you eat when the world turns to ice? We're not talking about being a little cold or skipping lunch. We're talking about entire landscapes buried under snow, trees stripped of fruit, rivers locked in ice, days so short they feel like dusk, nights so long they feel like punishment. And in that harsh stillness, Native American families didn't just endure, they thrived. Here's the catch: they had no fridges, no thermoses, no preservatives, no backup plans, just knowledge. Knowledge passed down like firelight. Knowledge that let them store meat for a year, preserve berries through spring, and lock in nutrients like vitamin C when scurvy was killing colonists by the hundreds. Most of us would freeze or starve without modern help. But they didn't just survive winter. They planned for it, prepared for it, outsmarted it. Weird part? Their winter survival system was rooted in three unlikely pillars: fermentation, fat, and foraging. Let that sink in. While settlers were chopping trees for smoky log cabins and hoping their salted pork wouldn't rot, native communities were burying fermented fish for spring protein, hanging pemmican ropes in tipi rafters, and drying pawpaw cakes above low ember fires. And the food? It wasn't scraps. It wasn't bland. It wasn't backup. It was engineered by the environment itself. Pawpaw cakes thick with wild fruit sugars. Acorn stew balanced with ash for digestibility. Mayhaw jelly preserved like gold. Cornbread baked in coals, light, smoky, calorie-dense. But here's what most people miss. Their food system wasn't about flavor, it was about physics. These weren't just recipes. They were designs. Built on temperature control, microbial timing, seasonal cycles, and group labor. And they worked, because unlike European pantries that relied on cold cellars or salted meat, Native American preservation didn't fight nature, it flowed with it. They smoked meat slowly in cold months when bacteria grew slowest. They buried fermented foods in shaded soil, where the temperature stayed between 38 and 45 degrees. They stored fat in clay-sealed pots, mimicking vacuum sealing centuries before we even knew what that was. And the result? A family could feed itself for months through whiteout storms, hunting droughts, or ice-thick rivers, with food they'd grown, gathered, or preserved with zero electricity. Think that's impressive? Let's go deeper. Because it wasn't just how they stored food, it was what they chose to preserve. Take pemmican, dried meat pounded to powder, mixed with hot rendered fat, sealed into stone-hard cakes. Each bite, over 3,000 calories. Shelf-stable for years. Portable. Nutrient-rich. It was the original superfood. Or fermented fish, a concept that might make some stomachs turn. But microbiologists today say the process rivaled modern probiotics in both safety and nutrient density. Or pawpaw fruit, a North American tropical fruit rich in magnesium, vitamin C, and natural sugar picked when ripe, mashed into cakes, dried above fire, and eaten mid-January when nothing else grew. Smart move, right? But here's the painful contrast. While native communities were building these ultra-resilient food networks, colonists were dying of starvation, with barns full of rotting produce, and salted meat teeming with bacteria. In fact, scurvy was a common winter killer among European settlers, caused by vitamin C deficiency. But among native tribes, it was rare. Why? Because foods like sumac tea, spruce tip syrup, dried berries, and acorn mash carried the essential vitamins that warded off disease. They didn't have charts. They didn't have labels. They didn't need them. They had intimacy with the land. That's the uncomfortable part modern systems don't like to admit. We build insulation thicker. They build smarter. We store energy in batteries. They stored it in seeds, in roots, in clay pots buried beneath frost. And we call that primitive? The deeper truth is this. Every winter, nature asks a question. Do you understand me enough to live through this? And Native American communities answered clearly, season after season, with techniques so refined, so precise, so efficient that scientists today are still learning from them. This isn't nostalgia. It's engineering. It's environmental science. It's cultural resilience. And it all begins with a tipi, a cold wind, and a single decision made months before the snow ever falls. How do we feed the village when the world is asleep? That's the question we'll answer. One food, one tool, one fire at a time. Let's go inside. Let's step into the warmth. Let's uncover the genius of Native American winter survival, not with myth, but with proof. Because once you see how it works, you'll never look at winter or food the same way again. Let's strip away the snow and step inside. At first glance, the tipi looks simple. Just poles, hide, and fire. But here's the strange thing. It's not a tent. It's a machine. The tipi is a self-regulating thermal system built not just for warmth, but for survival science. The conical shape, it cuts wind instead of catching it. The liner, it traps heat. The smoke flaps, they work like lungs, pulling in fresh air, exhaling smoke. Everything about the tipi was designed to manipulate temperature, airflow, and moisture using nothing but hides, fire, and intuition. Weird part? Architects today still study tipi airflow because it works. Let's break it down. The liner system, often made from buffalo hides or bark-wrapped mats, created a thermal gap. Warm air from the fire rose between the liner and outer wall, then cycled downward. A full convection loop, all inside one living space. Now, those smoke flaps at the top, they weren't fixed. They moved. Families adjusted them throughout the day, depending on wind, weather, and how much heat or smoke they needed to keep in or out. Open both flaps wide, smoke cleared fast. Close one side, the draft curved, warming the floor. Angle them just right, and the tipi breathed with the wind. Smart move, one that modern passive housing systems still struggle to replicate. The ground wasn't ignored, either. Beneath the feet, tipi floors were layered with dried grass, fur, bark mats, and stones. Why? Because cold sinks. The earth pulls heat downward. But layered correctly, that floor became an insulator. It stayed dry, warm, stable, and it got smarter. Families would heat stones in the fire, then place them beneath the bedding layers, beneath drying racks, or beside sealed food bundles. These stones released warmth slowly through the night, keeping food safe, bodies warm, and humidity balanced. One scientific study tested tipi interiors at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, with a small fire and proper venting, temperature stayed between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That's comfort. That's control. That's climate mastery without machines. But here's the insight most people miss. The heat wasn't for luxury. It was part of the preservation system. Inside that warm, breathable space, food was processed, stored, and protected through precise temperature control. Let's start with pemmican. Dried meat pounded into powder. Melted fat stirred in warm. Sometimes dried berries added for flavor and vitamin boost. But the fat had to be hot enough to flow, not too hot to burn. And the meat had to be bone dry. So where did they do it? Inside the tipi. High above the fire, meat strips hung on racks to smoke slowly. Not char, not roast, dry. That smoke, rich in antimicrobial compounds, pulled moisture from the meat and wrapped it in a natural preservative shield. Some tribes added sweetgrass, sage, or juniper to the fire, further boosting the antibacterial effect. Next, they made pawpaw cakes. Pawpaw fruit, rich in sugar, magnesium, and vitamin C, was mashed into pulp, pressed into flat cakes, then dried near warm zones of the tipi. Not directly over fire, but close enough for slow dehydration. These cakes could last months, even midwinter. Then came acorns. Now here's the catch. Raw acorns contain tannins, bitter and harmful in large amounts. So native cooks boiled them with wood ash. The alkali neutralized the tannins, making the nut mash not just edible, but nutritious. The science? It's called alkaline hydrolysis. And it happened in hide pots over low flames, with constant stirring, careful timing, and testing by touch, not thermometer. Here's the aha moment. Native families didn't need charts or tools. They had rhythm. They had feel. They had lived chemistry, passed down not in books, but in memory. They fermented berries in clay pots, sealed with animal fat or wood ash. They packed boiled stew meat into bark-lined containers. They used smoke, air, time, and instinct to master spoilage. Even the tipis, shaded corners, served a purpose: cooler zones for sealed pots, clay jars, and wrapped bundles. Inside the same structure, warm zones helped fermentation. Cool corners slowed bacterial growth. Thermal zoning without a thermostat. And when storms rolled in, families tightened the smoke flaps, pulled stones closer, moved food to higher racks, sealed the pot lids with fresh bear fat. Nothing panicked. Everything adapted. Because winter was expected, planned for, designed into every layer of the home and every bite of food that would carry them through it. Inside the tipi, you weren't just surviving. You were engineering survival. So now that we understand how the tipi functioned as both shelter and climate lab, it's time to look at the tools. The racks, pots, hides, stones, knives, pits, and preservation systems, each one a piece of a larger design. Let's open the toolkit and discover what kept these families alive when the world outside turned to ice. Let's open the toolkit. Because when winter came and the winds howled across the plains, it wasn't brute strength that saved the village. It was quiet preparation. No machines, no electricity, just a system of tools, crafted, tested, refined, to turn the harshest season into something survivable. Let's start with one of the greatest inventions in survival history, pemmican. At first glance, it seems simple. Dried meat, melted fat, maybe a few berries. But here's the genius. It's a calorie-dense, shelf-stable, portable superfood that could last not just weeks, but decades. To make it, meat had to be sliced into thin, even strips, often no thicker than a finger. That required stone scrapers and obsidian blades sharp enough to shave, yet strong enough to handle elk or bison muscle. Then came drying. Meat was hung high above a low smoke fire, inside or just outside the tipi. The smoke dried it slowly over 2 to 3 days, while also coating it with natural phenols and acids that repelled bacteria. No timers, no thermometers, just feel, scent, and generations of trial and correction. Once dried, the meat was pounded into powder, not chunks. This step was crucial. Large pieces would go rancid. But fine powder, it blended evenly with fat and sealed out air. Enter the fat. This wasn't just drippings. Native cooks rendered suet or kidney fat over hot stones or in bark-lined pots. This type of fat had a high melting point, which meant it stayed solid in cold temperatures and locked out moisture. Then, while still warm, it was poured into the powdered meat, stirred by hand, pressed into balls, bars, or hide-wrapped bundles, sealed tight, sometimes buried in snow, sometimes hung in rafters. And just like that, they had survival in solid form. 1 pound of pemmican, over 3,000 calories. Enough to fuel a hunter for an entire day, or feed a family through a snowstorm. Now, here's the weird part. Studies today show that properly made pemmican can retain nutritional value for up to 50 years. That's not food. That's legacy. But pemmican was just one piece of the toolkit. Let's talk about pawpaw cakes, made from North America's largest native fruit. The pawpaw, rich in natural sugars, potassium, and magnesium, ripened just before frost. Perfect timing. Tribes mashed the fruit into pulp, then poured it into shallow bark trays, or spread it on heated stones near the fire. Over several hours, the warmth evaporated moisture, turning the mash into a leathery cake that could be rolled, tied, and stored. These weren't snacks. They were glucose batteries, natural sugar boosts, preserved without a single grain of salt or ounce of syrup. Then came the nuts. Acorns, despite their bitterness, were high in fat, fiber, and carbohydrates. But to make them edible, you needed chemistry. First, acorns were crushed using stone mortars carved into boulders or logs. Then the flour was leached in water infused with wood ash, creating an alkaline bath that removed tannins. What's brilliant is this: tribes adjusted the leaching time based on taste. Bitterness meant more time. Sweetness meant success. Once treated, the mash was shaped into dumplings or cakes, then dried on hot stones near the hearth. Some were packed in ash-lined bark containers and buried in snowbanks to last the winter. That brings us to the next great tool: underground storage pits. Think of them as natural refrigerators, dug deep into soil where temperatures stayed steady between 38 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Lined with bark, straw, or sweetgrass, these pits stored root vegetables, dried meats, fat-sealed jars, and even fermented fish. Stones were stacked on top to keep out predators, while carved markers helped families track which pits held which goods. Some tribes even built pit networks, rows of storage holes across sheltered areas, each one rotated seasonally to avoid spoilage. Now here's the kicker. Archaeologists have found pits big enough to hold over 2,000 pounds of preserved food. That's enough to carry a full village through winter, all without a single freezer. Let's talk containers. Before Tupperware, before mason jars, there were clay pots and bark vessels. But these weren't just crude jars. They were engineered for function. Clay was hand-mixed with crushed shell or sand to prevent cracking under heat. Pots were shaped by coil or press, then fired in open-air pits or embers. Some were coated in pine resin, a natural sealant that repelled moisture and bacteria. Others had wide mouths for storing dried herbs, or narrow necks for sealing meat under a cap of bear fat. Yes, animal fat was a preservation tool. Rendered into liquid, poured over food, and cooled into a seal, it kept air and bacteria out. This method, used in combination with bark wrapping or clay, could preserve cooked meat for up to 6 months. Then came fermentation. Some foods were buried in leaf-lined pits and left to transform. Berries, fish, even nuts, processed by good bacteria, preserved for digestion, and stored in cool darkness. Microbiologists today say these pits maintained the ideal pH levels for safe fermentation, all without measuring devices. And the tools weren't just physical. They included timing systems, like placing storage near snowdrifts in early winter, or rotating dried wrecks as seasons shifted. Families marked jars with scratches or knot patterns, a pre-literate calendar of what was made and when. Even the fire was a tool. Low, slow fires, fueled by dried dung or pine needles, produced steady heat without flame. That meant no scorching, just warmth. Perfect for drying, simmering, and curing. And yes, tools were shared, passed down, perfected. From a grandmother's shaped stirring stick to a carved bone scraper used only for hide-fat separation, every item had meaning, function, and memory. Because survival wasn't about panic, it was about preparation. And now that we've seen the tools, let's step into the rhythm of winter life itself. How did families, day by day, harvest, prepare, rotate, and consume this food? What were the daily behaviors, the rituals, that made all of this possible? Let's follow them through the snow and see how they moved, cooked, gathered, and endured. Because tools are only as powerful as the hands that use them. Let's step outside the tipi and follow the rhythm of survival. Because all the tools in the world mean nothing unless you know how to use them. That's where daily behavior came in. Practice, ritual, memory, woven into movement. Survival wasn't just about storing food. It was about how you lived with it, how you carried it, cooked it, guarded it, shared it. And it all started with motion. The tipi was mobile, built to be packed, moved, and reassembled in under an hour. Families could strike camp at sunrise, poles bundled like spokes, hides rolled tight, tools wrapped in fur and slung over dogs or horses. By midday, they could reach a new site, and by sunset, the fire was burning again. Why move so often? Because survival required mobility. Follow the herds, follow the thaw, follow the forage. It was a dance with the seasons, never static. And yet, even in motion, food stayed safe. Pemmican bundles were tied to cross beams, high above the fire, away from moisture. Dried berries were sealed in bark tubes and tucked into satchels. Acorn cakes were wrapped in hide and placed near the body, the original heat pack, keeping them soft, ready to eat. Here's the smart move. Instead of hauling hundreds of pounds of raw food, families moved concentrated nutrition, high-calorie, low-weight bundles. One bag of pemmican could feed a traveler for 2 weeks. One pawpaw cake could keep a child energized through a storm. Now picture winter settling in. Snow starts to fall. Rivers freeze. Foraging becomes a memory. So how did native families adapt? They didn't wait for hunger. They rotated roles. The fire tender woke first, coaxing embers back to life. Then came the forager, who checked the traps, scanned for signs of rabbits or squirrels, harvested bark or needles for tea. The cook, usually an elder or mother, began preparing warm meals from what had been preserved. Pawpaw mash, dried meat, stew stones still warm from the night before. These meals weren't random. They were sequenced. Morning stews for energy, midday fruitcakes for glucose, evening fat-rich broths to sustain the body overnight. Even the way they slept was strategic. Families curled around the fire pit, arranged in a radial circle, oldest near the center, youngest in the arms of elders, feet pointing outward. This wasn't just for warmth. It was so that anyone waking in the night could check the smoke flaps, stir the fire, adjust the drying racks without stepping over others. One motion, one gesture, shared by all. Let's talk about those smoke flaps. They weren't set and forget. They moved with the wind. Children as young as 8 learned to read the breeze, adjusting the flaps with poles, tightening one side, loosening another, controlling how fast smoke rose. how long heat lingered. It was microclimate tuning, practiced daily. Then came drying cycles. Families rotated meat strips on a sunpath system, shifting them from east to west through the day, using tipi shadows as natural timers. A certain shadow length meant turn the fish. Another meant collect the acorn cakes. These shadows weren't superstition. They were science. And when blizzards struck, everything changed. The outside world disappeared. But the inside came alive. Children helped turn stones, keeping them warm for use under blankets. Elders checked buried clay pots, pressing on fat seals, listening for cracks, smelling for sourness. The cook prepared high-fat soups, bone broth thickened with dried root mash, to keep calories high, bodies stable. And still, nothing wasted. Ash from the fire, stirred into water to make alkaline solution for processing new acorns. Bones from last night's stew, crushed, boiled again, until the broth turned milky. Old hides beyond repair, cut into strips to seal containers. Insulation, storage, cordage. Here's the inside. Winter was not downtime. It was lab time. A season for learning, refining, perfecting. Young ones memorized which berries fermented fastest, which clay cracked in the cold, how to tell spoiled pemmican from safe. They practiced cutting frozen meat into shavings, a skill needed for midwinter snacking when the stew was gone and the snow was too deep to hunt. And yes, they foraged even in winter, not with baskets, but with memory. They knew where the wild onions slept, hidden under frost, where rose hips still clung to thorny bushes, where the inner bark of certain trees could be peeled, boiled, and used for tea or thickener. This wasn't scavenging. It was mapped knowledge, encoded in stories, landmarks, and songs. Even snow had a purpose. Snow was insulation. It buried the meat pits. It sealed the clay jars. It became walls for makeshift windbreaks. It was packed around fermented fish to slow the process, or used to freeze a broth into jelly for travel. And while food simmered, stories were told. Not for entertainment, but for instruction. Tales about the wrong kind of fat to seal a pot. About the time a berry ferment went too long. About the bear who raided the cache because someone forgot to plant sweetgrass around it. Every failure became a parable. Every success, a lesson repeated. Here's the beautiful part. Every family member was part of the system. No one stood outside survival. From child to elder, each had a role, a rhythm, a set of tools. And that's why the system worked. Because it wasn't one person's knowledge, it was collective engineering, refined across time, tested in wind, passed through hands. So now that we've walked through the living application, let's ask the big question. What did all this achieve? What were the results, the outcomes of this indigenous survival model? Not just calories, but connection. Not just shelter, but science in action. Let's uncover the benefits, the impact of this winter system that needed no machines, only memory. So what did all of this achieve? Let's set aside the poetry, the mystique, the nostalgia. Let's look at the results. Because Native American winter systems weren't just about making do. They were optimized ecosystems, and the benefits were measurable, visible, and decades ahead of their time. Let's begin with the obvious. Tipis used just a tenth of the wood required to build and heat a traditional log cabin. That's not a guess, it's documented. While settlers needed cords of lumber to survive one winter, native families gathered dry branches, dung, or driftwood, using fire not as brute force, but as a carefully managed flame, feeding a space that retained heat, recycled air, and adapted in real time. Less wood, more warmth. And the kicker? Tipis could be disassembled and moved without leaving scars on the land. Try doing that with a cabin. But it wasn't just about shelter. It was about food sustainability. Pemmican, pawpaw cakes, acorn stew, fermented fish. These weren't just tasty. They were nutritional technologies. Here's the insight. These preservation methods didn't just store food, they preserved nutrients. Settlers died of scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that wrecked immune systems. Native tribes, they brewed pine needle tea, dried berries, stored pawpaw cakes, and used ash-processed acorns, all rich in ascorbic acid, potassium, calcium, and healthy fats. They didn't know the periodic table, but they knew what healed and what harmed. That's knowledge. Even modern dietitians now recognize the genius of pemmican, a perfect blend of lean protein, essential fat, and antioxidants. It fuels muscles, stabilizes blood sugar, keeps energy high without crashing. But the benefits went beyond the body. There was social resilience. In the tipi, food wasn't owned. It was shared, hung above for all to reach, stirred in one communal pot, packed together, preserved together, eaten together. This created bonds that weathered storms beyond the weather, from grief to loss to forced relocation. And here's the part few mention. This system had low environmental impact and high ecological intelligence. Winter food strategies used what nature offered, but never exhausted it. Fat was rendered, not wasted. Bones boiled twice. Ash recycled into leaching water. Even storage pits were rotated seasonally, giving the land time to rest. Contrast that with today's systems, where food travels thousands of miles, wrapped in plastic, stored in fossil-fueled warehouses, only to expire and be thrown away. Native systems had near zero food waste. And that's not an ideal. That's history. Now let's talk emotional benefit. Because yes, food was fuel. But it was also memory. Every pot sealed with bear fat, every pawpaw cake marked with an elder's symbol, carried stories. Making food was an act of reclaiming continuity, saying, we remember how, we remember who, we remember together. That's a kind of benefit no data sheet can measure. But there's more. By living with seasonal awareness, by syncing meals with weather, cycles, and community, Native American food systems reduced stress, increased adaptability, and created predictability in a world where snowstorms could kill and frostbite came in minutes. It gave people rhythm, structure, peace. So what did all this achieve? Here's the full picture. Lower fuel use, higher nutrient retention, better immunity through winter, less environmental damage, stronger social bonds, minimal waste, maximum resilience. And they did it without machines, without imported goods, and without refrigeration. They did it through observation, refinement, and respect, turning food into a science of survival. And now that we've seen what it gave them, let's ask, what can it give us? Because this isn't just about the past. It's a map forward, one we urgently need. Let's end where all good knowledge points, not in the museum, but in the mirror. The final part is not just a conclusion, it's a call. What if the answers we're searching for were already buried in snow? What if the blueprint for resilience didn't lie in innovation, but in remembering? Because here's the truth. Native American winter systems weren't survival tactics. They were philosophies, ways of thinking, ways of living, ways of being in relationship with land, food, and time. And today, as we face climate instability, food insecurity, and broken connections, that philosophy might just be our way back. Let's take a final look. These communities didn't rely on mass production. They relied on memory. They didn't extract from the land. They listened to it. Each root they harvested was known by season. Each pit they buried was aligned with the cold. Each preservation method, from clay-sealed meat to fermented berries, was shaped by what nature allowed, not what man demanded. Here's the catch. They never tried to conquer winter. They made peace with it. They didn't fear scarcity. They planned for abundance differently. They understood that true sustainability isn't about buying the right brand. It's about knowing when to gather, when to store, when to share, and maybe, more importantly, when to stop. Weird part? Modern science is just catching up. Researchers now confirm that pemmican provides one of the most efficient calorie-to-weight ratios in human history. Clay pot fat sealing methods have been shown to prevent bacterial growth with 95% effectiveness, rivaling modern refrigeration. Fermentation pits kept food safe through pH-controlled bacterial ecosystems, centuries before we had the word microbiome. But they didn't need labs to know it worked. They trusted what they'd observed over generations. And that trust, that intergenerational continuity, is what we've lost. Today, we rely on apps to tell us what to eat, on machines to keep food cold, on strangers to grow our meals thousands of miles away. But native communities, they relied on each other. One child remembered which tree held the winter sap. One elder knew how thick to stir the fat. One mother sensed by smell if the fermentation had gone too far. That's ancestral intelligence, encoded in rhythm, not code. And now, in a world facing food shortages, rising costs, and ecological collapse, that intelligence is no longer just historical. It's urgent. Here's what we're left with: a model that used zero electricity, created zero landfill waste, required no global shipping chains, and kept families alive, well-fed, warm, and together through winters that would freeze most of us in days. But most of all, it did something even deeper. It kept people connected to place, to season, to responsibility. Because you can't forget where your food comes from when your bare hands pulled it from the snow. That kind of knowledge doesn't just feed you, it grounds you. And maybe that's what we're most hungry for now. So let's not just study this knowledge. Let's respect it. Let's protect it. Let's bring it forward with honor, not to romanticize the past, but to restore the relationship we lost when we traded memory for convenience. Because Native American winter systems weren't about the cold. They were about continuity. And now, more than ever, we need to remember what they never forgot. That food is not a product. It is a relationship. That survival is not a scramble. It is a system. That winter is not the enemy. It is the teacher. So here's the invitation. Not just to survive the next storm, but to change how we live before it arrives. Preserve what matters. Gather with purpose. Eat with memory. And always, always protect native knowledge. Live sustainably with the land. And pass it on.